Richard Poe is the author of Black Spark, White Fire and the former senior editor of Success magazine. He is also an avocational archaeologist. I've really enjoyed your book, Black Spark, White Fire. Where'd the name come from? I read the book, but I didn't get the connection with Black Spark, White Fire.
Well, the name refers to one of the ideas I talk about is the fact that some scholars have alleged that European civilization had its origin in Africa. And that's a whole other subject. I don't know if we're going to get into that as much, but there's a theory which I explore that civilization began in Egypt, and that to a great extent what we call Western civilization, which arose in Greece, was directly influenced by the Egyptians, not only through Greeks studying in Egyptian temples and so forth, but perhaps even through direct colonization of Greece. So what I would be referring to in the title is the black spark of Egyptian and African civilization, sparking the fire or the conflagration of European civilization, or Western civilization as it's called.
Well, let's get into that. That's a very good starting point. Now,
Okay.
conventional wisdom among conventional historians and scholars is that Egypt is in essence not a part of Africa, and that in effect, and I have read directly this, that Egyptians were white. Would you comment on those 2 points?
Well, sure. You know, the Egyptians, by any normally accepted American definition of the word, were certainly black. I don't think you'll find, in fact, any expert who's really studied the issue who disagree with it. That's the interesting thing about it. To the average person, there's a big controversy over whether the Egyptians were black. But I was in a debate, for instance, with Mary Lefkowitz. Now, she wrote a book called Not Out of Africa, in which she purported to debunk supposedly all the Afrocentric claims, and she's always held up as the Bible of the anti-Afrocentrists. Now, I debated her on the Armstrong-Williams show, and I asked her directly, and Armstrong asked her directly, were the Egyptians black? And she actually admitted that they were, by the American definition of the word. Now, there's some fine, hair splitting we can get into, but at the very least, the Egyptians were part black. Now, were they part black? Were they more than part black? That's a whole other scholarly controversy, which I explore in the book.
Were they black like a very, very dark-skinned, broad-nosed, thick-featured African in the Sahara, or were they black like African Americans?
Well, what they appear to be is black like African Americans.
In other words, a broad spectrum.
A very, very broad spectrum. In fact, there's 2 mummies called the Two Brothers, and these are mummies that were found in a tomb together. The hieroglyphic inscriptions made clear that they had the same parents and that they were blood brothers. Yet the archaeologists who found them, which was at the turn of the century, were baffled because they examined their skulls. They said, well, one is clearly quote-unquote Negroid and the other is clearly quote-unquote Caucasoid. And so they developed all kinds of fanciful theories. Perhaps one was adopted or this or that. And it simply didn't occur to them that within a black family, you can have people with very different physical characteristics being born of the same mother or born of the same parents.
Well, again, we go back, I think, to the problem, and the problem is the American definition of who is black. And is, in fact, with your phenotype or your physical type, you could be black in America.
Indeed.
And with the darkest black person in America, they could be black. So black in America doesn't really relate to complexion. It relates to a social position, or a position that's been defined by political and social factors. But in Egypt, you have, I think, a very, very major contribution in your book. And I point out that all Americans who are interested in an accurate history should know something of Joseph H. Greenberg, who you devote a section of your book to, or research that he basically founded. And that Mr. Greenberg points out in the disuniting of America. That's another anti-Afrocentrist scholar. What's his name?
Schlesinger.
Schlesinger. Who was splitting hairs with who was Hamitic. And as Greenberg points out, and you pointed out, that would mean that Haile Selassie, the former emperor of Ethiopia, could not have been an African
Yes.
because he was a Hamitic. So that's splitting hairs to take one group and say, well, this group is black, but it's really not black. It's Hamitic,
Right.
or et cetera and so forth. And then there is in the confusion of the average American, there is the term Middle East, which didn't come into currency until, as I read, until the World War II in the 40s. Up to that point, everybody called what we call the Middle East today, Northeast Africa. So in the minds of people, they see pictures in the movies of Egyptians, and they all look like you or lighter.
Charlton Heston.
Charlton Heston is a typical Moses. And then they see the Middle East, and they never associate Middle East with Africa. So the confusion is there. Would you begin explaining the dynamics of separating Egypt from the rest of Africa?
Well, this basically happened in the 19th century. Anthropologists decided that certain parts of Africa, particularly the Northeast, Egypt, the Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and those countries in that area, they decided that the people there, because they had features in many cases that looked to them different from people in other part of Africa, constituted a sub-race or even a different race from other Africans. They called them Hamites. And in that part of Africa, you'll see people who look like Haile Selassie or like the Somali model Iman. You'll see people with long, thin noses, perhaps, or other features that are looked upon or were looked upon by those anthropologists as being quote-unquote Caucasoid. And so they decided this was a distinctly different people, even though many of these same people are definitely regarded as black today, and if they walked down the street in New York City, they would be looked upon as black. It was decided rather arbitrarily that people from that part of Africa are something called Hamites, and that they are distinct racially and culturally and linguistically in terms of their languages from people in other parts of Africa, particularly West Africa, where the slave trade was active. And there, they said, in West Africa was the home of the so-called true Negro, by which they meant those with the most Negroid features, quote-unquote, the broadest noses, the woolliest hair, the thickest lips, etc. So they said that anyone who didn't fit that particular physical description was really not pure, quote-unquote, Negro in the term of the day. And was therefore, they postulated perhaps a mixture with whites or with some other kind of group, neither white nor black, but simply, another race. They did it for an obvious reason, because the high civilizations that existed in Ethiopia and particularly in Egypt, they wanted to separate them from the rest of Africa, and they especially wanted to separate them from West Africa.
And because black Americans are from West Africa, black Americans could have no link to Egypt.
Yes, absolutely. And you hear this argument is made right down to the present day, because when people such as Arthur Schlesinger, the liberal author who wrote The Disuniting of America, when he set out to debunk Afrocentrism, which he likened to the Ku Klux Klan, this was the argument he used. He said, because the Egyptians were on one side of the African continent, and they were one type of people, and the American, the ancestors of the American blacks came from another side of the continent. Therefore, there's just no connection, and they have no right to claim any kind of cultural connection. Now, to me, this is transparently a stupid argument. I happen to be half Russian Jewish and half Mexican by my upbringing. I'm a mixture, like a lot of people in this country. But, I've been called white boy enough times walking down the street that I know where I fit, in the American scheme of things. But the fact is, I could say, hey, my Jewish ancestors maybe came from the Middle East. I could say some of my Mexican ancestors may not have come from Europe at all. But I identify as a white person, and I identify with everything that happened in Europe. and Europe is just as wide and broad as Africa is. And I can tell you, every white person thinks that way. You know, a lot of times when this Afrocentric discussion comes about, people will say, you know, white people in particular, they'll say, well, look, my ancestors were Norwegian, so I don't have anything to do with the Romans, so why should you, as a black person, say you have anything to do with the Egyptians? Now, I would say as a white person, anytime a white person tells you that, he's lying, you know, and that's what you should tell him, because he is simply telling you a bald-faced lie to your face to say he doesn't identify with the Romans or the Greeks. That's absolute nonsense. The identification is obvious and total.
Aren't all or most of the European languages based on Latin?
Well,
I mean,
they're related. They're related. They're actually.
Well, I mean, but the Roman Empire, the Roman civilization, is the big brother to the European civilization, is it not?
Yeah.
With Greece mixed in there for culture?
Yeah, it is to some extent. Actually, if you can go even farther back and say the Indo-European language, you know, from 6000 BC, ultimately, almost all European languages are descended from that, with a few exceptions like Basque, Finnish, Hungarian. Some of them come from Asia, but there's definitely a connection. But the thing is, even in those areas that aren't directly connected, let's say the Basques who live in Spain, they have different blood types from other Europeans. They have a language that's not related to any other European. But a Basque comes to America and he's a white person, and he's a European, you know, and I guarantee he feels that he's a white person like every other white person in Europe. So it's clearly a case when someone like Arthur Schlesinger comes forward and says, blacks can't think this way. What he's saying is that whites may think this way, but blacks may not.
In other words, any white American, European American, whether from Europe or not, any white American can identify with all of Europe. It's implicit in our culture.
Yes, it's automatic.
But if a black person wants to identify with Egypt, an African American wants to identify with Egypt or Nubia or Canaan or Ethiopia, one of the great civilizations, that's called cheating.
Yes,
Or
exactly.
I don't think being Afrocentric or Eurocentric has much to do with the facts. The facts are there. And if you discover through your research certain pieces of evidence, as Joseph H. Greenberg did, and he there are antecedents to Mr. Schlesinger, and those white scholars were pretty much put out of business back in, the 30s or 50s by Greenberg's research, because he went through every African language, every language on the continent, did he not?
Yes, and his work is very important. I had the honor, when I wrote Black Spark, White Fire, of doing an extensive series of interviews with Joseph Greenberg. He's widely regarded as probably the most brilliant living linguist today. And his findings are conclusive, but not too many people know what they are because they're controversial in some ways. The thing
But there was, pardon my interruption, but there was a school of thought that was in concrete in scholarly circles in 1930, 1940 in the United States, that after his research came along in the 50s, because he graduated from Harvard, I think, in 50, 51, or something like that. So after he did his research, that other school pretty much went away. The school that said that in effect it translated into that there was no link between black Americans and Egypt. His research, linguistic research, I think pretty much put it to bed.
It should have gone away. I think in some ways it just went underground, but it's
Well,
no
Mr.
longer
Schlesinger brought it back up again.
Right, it's no
in his
longer
book.
respected.
Yeah, he resurrected it, and as far as the public was concerned, it's the first time they had heard it.
Yeah,
So
no,
that old theory sounded palatable in many ways.
he attacked the Hamitic theory on a number of fronts, but the most important thing that he did was that he classified
Greenberg.
Joseph Greenberg. He classified all of the languages of Africa, which had never been done before. He took all the languages, of which there are hundreds, and he discovered which ones were related to which and how they were related. Now, this was very important to the question of Egypt, because until then, the mainstream view about Egypt was that the Egyptians were often referred to as Hamites or sometimes even Semites. that there were somehow Middle Eastern people who had migrated into Africa from, the Middle East someplace, white people, who had inhabited Egypt and then spread further down and intermarried with people and bringing their quote-unquote superior civilization and so forth. Now, Greenberg discovered that exactly the opposite had happened. He discovered that the Egyptian language, the ancient language of the hieroglyphs, the language of the pharaohs who built the pyramids, that language, he found, was an African language which was related to a much more ancient language which he named Afro-Asiatic. This very ancient language had been spoken, he deduced, someplace in the vicinity of Ethiopia. Maybe, he thought around 6,000 BC. I think now they're saying more like 12,000 BC, as far back as that. But that this was the origin, that it was in Ethiopia that this great language family emerged. And this family of languages, people spread out from there, and it gave rise to many, many different African language families all across the continent, from the Cameroons to Nigeria to all over the place. One branch of this great African language family was called the Semitic branch. And these people who spoke this Proto-Semitic language migrated northward out of Africa and into the Middle East, and apparently they were a very powerful people, because to this day Semitic languages are spoken all across the Middle East. Arabic is a Semitic language. Hebrew is a Semitic language. Many of the ancient languages that are extinct now, Babylonian, Canaanite, Phoenician, many of these languages of the great Middle Eastern peoples were Semitic languages. Their original place of origin was Ethiopia, if you go back thousands of years. And Joseph Greenberg proved this conclusively, as well as anything can be proved with modern linguistic scientific technique. And what does it mean? You look at the Middle East, well, does that mean they all came from Africa? Well, not necessarily, because there were people already living there, but it means that Africans came into that area and probably became very politically powerful because they imposed their language on whoever was already there, and they probably intermarried with people who were there and so forth. But to this day, in the Middle East, you can see people who look very African right alongside people who may look like me, and there's a wide variety, but it's an interesting question which hasn't been explored very much, of going back and asking who were these original speakers of the Proto-Semitic language who came out of Africa. What did they look like, and what happened to them? It's a question that Greenberg really raised, which I don't think too many anthropologists have followed up on.
During the first century, the era of Jesus Christ, and that part of the what we call today the Middle East, which is Northeast Africa, were those people, for the most part, Afro-Asiatic, as Greenberg has labeled them? In other words, these titles that we call racial, Semitic, Caucasian, Negroid, these are language definitions for language groups, are they not?
Well, to some extent, I mean, the fact is language does not necessarily correlate with race, of course, because, for instance, here we are in the United States, we all speak English, but there are many different races. But it's a good bet, let's say, that if you have a group of people like the Afro-Asiatics coming out of Africa at 12,000 to 6,000 BC, that they probably were a distinct racial group that was characteristic of people who live in Ethiopia.
Is there a relationship between the development of Europe and Africa or Egypt?
Well, yes, in my book I very strongly take the position that Europe essentially derived civilization from Africa. And I think this is important for a number of reasons, but as I point out in my book, we're living pretty much, I guess, hopefully at the tail end of an era in which the so-called master race theory has been very influential in Western civilization. And I discuss in my book how when you go back to, let's say, Roman times, we were talking about this a little before. You were making some comments to this effect, but the notion of white superiority is not something that has always existed since the beginning of time. And in fact, I quoted a Roman author, Vitruvius, who was a great architect, who wrote a book about architecture in which he talked about a number of other issues too. Among them were the different peoples of the earth, and he discussed how people in the north are light in their complexion, and by the north he was of course referring to northern Europe and where the Germans and other such tribes lived, the Celts who had red hair and blonde hair and so forth. The Romans of course were a Mediterranean people, they were more of the brunette complexion, and he offered the opinion, which was apparently common in his day, that the people of the north were stupid and that they were barbarous and uncivilized, and that this was somehow associated with their lightness of complexion. And he said that people in the south, by which he meant Africa, which is the only place south of Italy, that they were dark in complexion and they were very intelligent and very highly civilized. And that was the way that the world looked to people of ancient times, and particularly of that time. And that same sentiment was echoed by Aristotle and other Greek writers, that they talked about, I think it was Aristotle, in fact, who said that the people of the north are very stupid, but they're very brave and warlike. And he said the people in the south are very intelligent, but they're not as good at war. And he said, but we Greeks, we're right in the middle and we're perfect.
That reminds me a little of modern America. Blacks aren't very bright, but they're good athletes.
Right.
That same color sentiment in reverse of what we have currently in Western civilization can also be found in Africa and in various parts, for example, in certain parts of India, where the very, very, very dark Dravidians, you see residuals in their culture of those who were the darkest were held in the greatest esteem, as though they were considered superior to those who were lighter. This was black and black, not, as it was in Europe. But the entire idea of who is superior and who's inferior has been fairly manipulated, though, as a concept, has it not?
Well, certainly in modern times, it's become a very powerful political tool. And it really began in the late 18th century, as I discussed in Black Spark, White Fire. And it seems to have been a situation simply where, at that time, Europe militarily and economically was reaching the point where the perception of Europeans was that, hey, nobody can stop us. They had gone to every continent practically of the earth and been able to plant colonies and overpower other nations and empires, which in the past they hadn't been able to do. In medieval times, as I discussed, Europe was on the defensive. The Mongols, who were an Asiatic people, conquered half of Europe and kept most of it for 400 years. The Moors conquered parts of Europe, and the Turks conquered large areas of Europe until modern times. So Europe has not always been on the offensive, but in the 18th century, Europe was feeling very robust and very successful because of the great success of the age of exploration. And so they came up with, scholars in Europe, that is, came up with a justification. Why is this? Why have we achieved such success? It must be that we're superior. And they went even further than that. They said something that Vitruvius and Aristotle probably wouldn't have liked. They said it's not just Europeans who are superior, but it's Northern Europeans in particular. And again, it was because the countries that were strong at that time were in Northern Europe primarily. They were, England, France. The Dutch were very powerful in the age of exploration. The Spanish had been powerful, but then they waned. And so it seems to a large extent that as people's political and economic power rises and falls, that people will invent racial justifications for their being where they are. And
I'd like to thank you very much for being with me.
Thank you.
Tony Brown Productions produces this program and is solely responsible for its content.